Welcome everyone to TPH first podcast. This is supposed to be more of a trial run before we actually, go on the details and see how we do this stuff. Welcome to the greatest podcast on Galaxy. I'm gonna go introduce myself and then we'll have our guests introduce themselves. So, about me, I'm Cros, as I said, your favorite moderator. I work in the storage industry. So if you have heard about SANs, NAS, a lot of storage that companies buy to store a lot of data and use that data really fast. That's what I do. I also am a grad student. I work on cryptography. But that's really all about me. Let's just talk about our guests. So maybe Trout, you can go on and introduce yourself a little bit to us.
Sure. I'm Trout. I'm a software engineer working in the accounting space. Actually, the company I work for is fairly well known. Does some accounting software and software for accountants to do various bits and bobs. Yeah, that's what I do for a living. There's not much more about me, to be honest. With regards to authentication and things, that's actually the sort of thing that I specifically work on. Certainly at the moment, integrating legacy systems and connecting them to the new world, so to speak, and all the authentication, the federated authentication that goes on with that. So yeah, that's about me. What about you, Shan?
Yeah, so I'm currently a senior at college. I've been interning at a company and I've gotten a full-time offer from them. They're a digital product studio, which probably isn't commonly heard. We do a lot of consulting for big name companies. But so the project turnover is like a couple of months or something, but I've been on a pretty mature project that's lasted like a couple of years. So that's different, but it's nice. In terms of development, I do like full stack development, so I'm a bit of everywhere. So I focus in on backend.
Yeah, that's excellent. Let's just dive right into our topic today. So, as you guys can see, it's Auth podcast, but a lot of our audience might actually not know what Auth is. It could mean either authentication and authorization. Like, would any of you guys would be willing to explain to our audience what each of these are and what are their actual aims?
Yeah, so I could tackle that. So let's just take, for example, a TPH user, right? If you're logged out of Discord and you need to log in, you're going to have to provide your email and your password and sometimes a verification code. And there might be like more stuff involved there, but that whole process is called authentication, where you're establishing an identity with an application. And then once you're actually logged in, and I see that there's a lot of like active plus users, but there's also like a lot of forgive me, I've never said this out loud, but Bepis, the road based off of Pepsi.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're a Bepis, you're allowed to change your nickname. And when you're not a Bepis, you're not allowed to change your nickname. That would be authorization, where you're sort of deciding what a user is allowed to do and what a user isn't allowed to do after they're authenticated. So TLDR is authentication is determining if a user has access to a system, and then authorization is determining what they're allowed to do once they're authenticated.
Right. So what you're trying to say is it's pretty much establishing an identity and giving rights to those identities to actually be able to do something. So that's pretty much what authorization and authentication is, and that is our topic of discussion today. What do you guys think are these different ways of achieving these aims of authorizing and authenticating a user or an identity to do something?
I mean, oftentimes you'll find people, especially when you see some of the questions in TPH and things, people lump them together, right? And they say, it's just semantics, because generally for any sufficiently complex system, you need both, right? And so people tend to lump them together, but the reason why they need to be so separate is because of these processes that you mentioned, whereby the processes of authentication and the processes of authorization have fundamentally different purposes and fundamentally different ways of achieving the goal.
Mm-hmm.
With regards to the way people achieve them, authentication has many different ways to do it, but it all centers around proving who you are, really. Whereas authorization is purely really focused on whether you, having already proven who you are, can perform a particular action on a particular resource is generally a good way of describing how these things work.
The way that authentication usually works, there is no one way. A lot of different implementations are around and a lot of different ideologies are around.
Mhm.
The way that authorization usually works is that someone at a higher level gives you permission. But determining how that person gives you permission is different across systems. For example, like on Discord, it might be that staff manually gives you a role. But on like a different system like a Google user group, somebody that's already an admin might need to manually toggle a permission on you. And so like it differs across systems.
Yeah, and we also have the difference there between not just it's often argued that this system of roles, this role-based access control, is one of the simplest access control mechanisms that exist. You also have various bits and bobs for requirements for more complex systems where it also depends on attributes of the user, and maybe it depends on times of day and external attributes for external systems and things like that. And that's when you start to get into the murky world of attribute-based access control and policy-based access control and all these terrifying things that people tend to experience and get confused about when it comes to AWS IAM and things like that. So authorization becomes an extremely complex topic. Authentication generally is a bit simpler. Once you start talking about all this SSO things anyway.
Right. So let's just talk about something simpler. As you said, authentication is simple. And you mentioned SSO right there. I mean, SSO, which is single sign-on, actually a really big thing. I think every company I have been in have used it. Every school I have been in have used it. Either it's through Outlook or through Google. Some even make their own. And there's a lot of advantages to using SSO, but there's also many disadvantages. What do you guys think about it? What are these advantages and disadvantages? And is it worth it for us to actually see it this prevalent in a traditional IT environment?
I mean, unless Shan, you want to say something on this? I mean, I would personally say that the whole single sign-on issue is very interesting. You do definitely see drawbacks with flexibility and with speed of granting access and things like that, and it can be a little frustrating for users when everything is certainly within a particular enterprise. When you have single sign-on for all the various apps, it means that permissions and things end up very centralized within the IT department, right?
Right.
But at the same time, that is in itself a huge advantage, right? IT need one place for managing employees and the access of employees, and it means you don't have cowboys wandering around giving people access to various things because it's convenient at the time, right?
Right.
That sort of the single sign-on thing becomes incredibly important the larger your organization gets.
Right.
I certainly know that mine is there's a huge drive for single sign-on. Almost every app almost every bit of tooling that we have, pretty much for the company to purchase the usage of that tooling requires that it will integrate well with the existing Active Directory solution that we have for employees to log in with.
Right.
Yeah, so whenever I think of SSO, I think of Google because that's very popular and everyone uses it. So if you want to like log into your Drive, it's going to direct you to accounts.google.com, even if you're on drive.google.com. Then once you log in, you'll be able to log into your Gmail, your calendar, and all of that, and it's shared across these subdomains. And the benefit of that is that if you only have like a single concept, like your whole company is based around a single concept, then that single sign-in is useful. But if you have like different concepts floating around in your company, then maybe a single sign-in isn't the best solution. For example, like if you were to imagine the TPH servers as an entity, right? Then maybe a single sign-on isn't the best idea between TPH and the pen tester Hangout because people have different access and different permissions and different names. I mean, it works for now because, it has different permission management, and different servers have like different spaces. But if this was like a full-on website idea, it might not work out nicely.
It might not, but it's all about convenience, right? The single sign-on is incredibly convenient for presenting a single platform to the user, right? So if we were to take the network as the example you gave, it would be, if this were a network of websites and forums rather than Discord, it may be that a single TPH identity provider would be ideal in that scenario, given that so many people are in multiple of these of the servers. But
Right.
I definitely see a point that it's not always ideal when you may have people that don't require access to bits and bobs. But then again, is that not sort of the point of centralizing the single sign-on, so that you can give people? So if we take different bits of developer tooling as an example, right? If you deploy an application, you may have access to the organization's GitHub, B, access to whatever CI environment you use, maybe CodeShip or whatever. You would have access to Sumo Logic, so logs, the application across the board, maybe New Relic for APM, maybe Datadog for infrastructure concerns, all these various bits and bobs. You want, ideally, one way to log into all of that. And you want IT to be able to say, right, this person is a developer, therefore they should have access to application logs and tracing, but they're not the operations team, so they don't need access to the monitoring of the infrastructure, and they don't need access to the deployment platform itself, right? So single sign-on is very important for managing the permissions there, and managing who has access to which.
Right. So single sign-on is more or less authentication, and it's like sharing different domains and having just one authentication point. But if you have like different projects to put on the same domain, you may not want that single authentication because they're different applications and they're different. They're like completely separate from one another, but they share the same domain or something.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets rough.
Right.
In addition, there might be other policies or laws that makes it a lot more weird to share between the two.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's really this compromise between security and convenience here, right? Like as you said, in a big IT environment, it just makes it so much easier for the IT guys not to mess up, like not be like, oh, this is so much work. We just give everyone this particular access, right? With single sign-on, you don't have to worry about IT guys actually slacking at their job and just messing it up. However, you also have this one single point of failure. So obviously, I guess, as we can see, it just depends on what are your requirements, and can you take that risk of single point of failure in your model and account for that. But yeah, it's definitely interesting. But we talked about SSO, and that actually reminded me of something we talked about in Server Meta last night. It was about federated login and logout, which I think is actually just kind of an evolution, a mutation. I don't know the exact word. Your best moderator in the server does not have the best English, but you get my vibes, right? And it's could really go on to just talk about what federated login and federated logout actually are and how they matter. And you also mentioned them about not being solved problems. So something for that matter.
Yeah. Shan, do you want to pop in first, or shall I?
Yeah, I get to give the small basic background, and then Trout gets to go into it really deeply.
Oh, nice. Thanks.
So federation is somewhat like you could think of it as a general concept without thinking of it in authentication to begin with. Federation, like in government or whatever, it's centralizing and standardizing things, and then in authentication, it's like creating a standard and protocol so that users' identities and whatever their signatures are, and et cetera, is all sort of like centralized, and they're also between enterprises. It's in sort of like layman's term, I would say that's next step right after SSO. So if you can't establish SSO properly, you're probably not going to want to go for a federated login and logout.
Mhm.
Or if you do have SSO, it's something that you might want to consider. And it might not be something that you do anyways, because it is the next step in SSO.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, so for federated login and logout, I think the easiest way to talk about it is actually not to consider the logins for various different services and things, right? The easiest way to think about federated login and logout is that, say you are a company that provides many, many different applications for your users to use, right? So Google, for example, it offers Gmail, it offers YouTube, it offers Google Drive, all these sorts of things, right? They're all on various subdomains of google.com. But you want to present a unified UX, right? You don't want users really to be thinking, oh, I'll log into Google Drive and I'll log into YouTube and I'll log into Gmail, right? What you want your users to be thinking about is, oh, I log into Google and I have access to all of these bits and bobs, right? And then I log out of Google. And logging out of Google means you log out of all these different bits and bobs. But the reality is that even though you're trying to present a unified experience
Mhm.
to the user, they are different applications at the end of the day, right? So, for example, some of the stuff I'm working on at the moment, right? So we have many, many applications that we allow the users to use, right? We have applications for them to do the payroll for their businesses, to do the accounting for their businesses, for accountants to do the tax stuff for the businesses, all these sorts of things, right? But we want the UX from the user's perspective to be one application, right? It's not one application. It's far, far too many applications. But we want it to appear as one application. And so this whole federated login and federated logout business is all about sort of pretending to the user that this is one great big platform that they're using. So when you log into one application, you log into all of them. And when you log out, you're logged out of all of them. And that is sort of the basis of federated login and logout. And the reason why I mentioned on Server Meta that they're not really solved problems is because although federated login has to a certain extent been standardized under OpenID Connect, federated logout is equally as important,
Mhm.
but it only has a draft spec, right? There's only a draft spec from OpenID Connect,
Right.
and everyone implements it differently.
It's
So
just a mess.
I mean, federated logout is a huge mess, and federated session management is also a huge mess, and that's why I mentioned on Server Meta that it's very much an unsolved problem. Certainly, federated logout is anyway.
Yeah, that makes sense. And actually, one really annoying thing about federated login, have you guys heard of the Nascar problem? Uh,
Mm.
so if you go to podcast, the channel, and I'll post an image right there, you'll see, and this is from a Japanese vending machine. Because of all these federated logins, all these different IDs you can use to connect to things, there's just so much clutter on the screen that it just makes the user experience awful. How do we go about selecting, like, how's this decision to select a certain platform for federated login? Because, we cannot give them everything, like in that image, because that just hurts your brain, literally looking at it.
I mean, it's an interesting one, but there's generally if you can give yourself one IDP
Mhm.
that then has the ability itself to delegate, then that in itself solves a lot of problems, right?
You're right.
So Auth0 is a company that does this really, really well.
Mhm.
If you make Auth0 your IDP, the provider for the federated login for all of your services, Auth0 will deal with all that behind the scenes, and they may have a little bit that when you sign up, you select the account that you wish to sign up via, and that may look a bit like the NASCAR problem. but
Mhm.
then sign in, you may find that there's a convenient property about the user that you can use across these systems, which is usually email, right? So you'll find with a lot of single sign-on implementations, because you've signed up with a
Right.
particular system, that is, they've then saved in their database that attached to your email address, they're using this login provider, and their ID with this login provider is such and such a GUID, right?
Mhm.
And then so all you need to do when you log in is actually you just give it your email address, and it goes, right, well, from this email address, I know that they've signed up with this provider ID and this provider type, and so I'll redirect them and they can log in via that instead. It's a
Okay.
common solution to it. I don't know whether that's something you've seen, Shan, with sites that you have single sign-on for, or not.
Yeah, so my take on it, well, first of all, like the NASCAR problem gets its name because the NASCAR vehicle usually has a bunch of logos and stickers from its endorsers and sponsors, et cetera, et cetera. And that's usually what happens when you go to a website. It has like 5 different login ways, like login with GitHub, login with Google, login with Twitter, et cetera, or login with email. And that creates a sort of a disconnaissance with what the user sees and then how they need to log in, and they have to think, and there's like multiple pages involved, and the workflow gets a bit complicated. The way that I like it personally is that you have to first determine what your service is providing, and then determine which third party you want to allow authentication from. Because like if you're like GitHub, for example, they have their own login system. But if you're going to Gitpod or if you're going to like Sandbox, um, that's still pretty technical. But it isn't something that you would log in from Twitter, right? It isn't something social per se. So you might want to allow GitHub as an icon, but not Twitter. And that way you start limiting the number of third-party buttons you have there to log in from. But yeah, I have sort of heard of your flow, and I haven't implemented it myself, but it is nice.
Yeah, just to say, Warren, from what you're saying on the podcast channel, you're saying a user wants to bring their IDP and things like that. What I'm suggesting is that the problem is moved back a level, right? From the perspective of your application doesn't have to deal with the various different providers because your application doesn't have to deal with various different providers because that's something the IDP itself can delegate to. And the IDP can itself deal with which login provider to choose based on the properties of the user. And there have been proposals to fix this via certificates in browsers and things like this, where you essentially the user selects their login preferences and it's saved to their browser, and each general IDP that delegates to others can pick based on that. But as you say, that's not a solved problem either, unfortunately.
So, just moving on, we talk about federated login and logout and some of the standards that implement logout differently. Have you guys ever worked with something like OAuth or OpenID? You know, what have your been experiences using these? And actually, a really interesting question someone gave me when I was getting this reviewed. What would you consider about rolling your own auth? Because, in cryptography, we say do not roll your own cryptography. Is it the same with auth? Like, do you roll your own auth if you have requirements that need your own auth?
Please don't. is all I'll say. It's so the OAuth specification and the frameworks that sit on top of it with OpenID Connect and the like are not easy. There are so many different, because the problem is they have to account for so many different flows of authentication, right? You could be logging in via a mobile device, you could be logging in via the web browser, you could be logging in via the command line, whatever, right? The point is authentication needs to deal with all these different flows.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, the specifications for the various different login flows you can have with OpenID Connect are not entirely simple. And
Right.
so that is why I highly recommend not trying to roll your own, because as soon as you need to implement another flow, you're completely screwed. I mean, even within the browser, there are multiple flows that you may need to use, right? Single page apps, you may need to use an authorization code flow that implements PKCE in order to get around the fact you need a direct secret and you can't trust, you need a dynamic secret and you can't trust the browser. Whereas server-side web app, you'll probably find with just a standard authorization code flow, things like that. All these different flows become incredibly complex when you try to implement them yourself. So it is far, far neater to rely on an IDP like Auth0 that can do all that for you, and your app just needs to interact with it.
I feel like
go
go ahead, Shan.
Okay, yeah. I was gonna say that it isn't worth trying to re-implement everything, but it is worth having your own authentication server for your own application, rather than relying on a third-party server.
Right.
But like trying to re-implement everything is going to take quite a while, first of all, and it's definitely not worth it for every single project that you do. But also, you're probably not going to be able to like reach a point that's better, because these people they still have like experts work on all this, but they still haven't solved every problem. So you're probably gonna, if you're like good enough and you were able to catch up with them, you're probably gonna have a lot of duplicate code that's the same as theirs, and there's no point. But also, you're gonna like hit roadblocks all the time, and it isn't worth it at all. But again, it is worth having your own server in some cases, where you have your own authentication.
Yeah,
in some cases, yeah, I would argue that in most, I would try to avoid it. Right, you can you can, for as long as you can get away with not implementing your own authentication server, you should avoid it, because it's so difficult to implement these things securely. The spec itself is ridiculous, and it's ridiculous for a reason, right? It needs to be secure. The spec itself is ridiculous, so delegating the responsibility for that as much as possible is definitely the way to go, in my view. But then again, it's just an opinion. Different people have different opinions on these sorts of things. But yes, it's not easy to implement at all.
Yeah, this seems to be a common opinion. I think entirety of this particular industry about security in general, right? In cryptography, you do not roll your own crypto. You just use a good library such as, Salt or Lipsodium or whatever, right? Over here also, as you guys said, just use something that's already been built by experts that have vetted that before and made sure that you do not actually just dig a hole that you'll die in yourself, right?
Yeah. The other side of it is that the specification for building these sorts of servers is ridiculous, and also because it's so complex, interacting with it sometimes isn't easy either, right? So, I mean, if we take what I would argue is the simplest but still usable flow that OpenID Connect offers, right? The authorization code flow. People talk about the implicit flow and things like that for single page apps, but arguably it shouldn't really be used anymore. So if you take the authorization code flow, it seems like almost fairly simple on the surface, right? You have an authorization, you redirect to an IDP, the IDP logs the user in, redirects the user back with a code, and then you can use your code to send a request and grab a token for that user, right? But there aren't actually good libraries for all tech stacks that will do that interaction for you. There are some for, .NET has decent libraries built in, and Rails stacks have things like OmniAuth and things like that. And in the same way, Node, I think, has a library called Passport and things like that, right?
Right.
But if you want to move outside of these boxes that these libraries provide, you suddenly realize that, well, actually, you are having to make a fair number of web requests manually, especially if there's things like PKC, proof key for code exchange, mixed into all this, right? And so that is a huge barrier, I think, to implementation, is the lack of really good, simple libraries that implement these things for interacting with IDPs for you.
Makes sense. So, I remember a really interesting story a while back. It was a user in TPH, Numel. I'm not sure if he's still around, but he had this problem where he actually lost his account because he had MFA enabled on Discord, and then he never had backup codes, and he lost his phone, which made it unable for him to actually get access to Discord again. And I think this just brings up a larger question, right? Like, where is this compromise between security and convenience? Because sometimes convenience for a company would actually mean more customers, and more customers would mean more monies, right? Because these customers are actually very happy with how easy your product is to use. And this is especially true with big companies, say Google or say Discord, where the tech support take ages to actually answer back, right? Like with your own company, with MFA, I could just call them, be like, hey, I actually lost my phone. Can I get MFA set on this phone? And they'll just do it instantly for me. However, with bigger companies like Discord and Google, that is just simply not either possible. And we all have heard bad stories about how bad Google's customer support is, for example. So where is this compromise between security and convenience? What do you guys think about that?
Just before we chat about it, is that not a problem though? If you were able to ring up your company and say, "Oh, I lost my phone. Could you reset? Could you set it up on this phone instead, please?" Is that not a problem?
It is not a problem if you can actually go and physically and verify your identity, right?
Okay, yes, if you can go physically
There's some
and
way to
verify your
verify identity.
Yeah. Yeah. Sorry, yeah, Chan, you want to have a
Yeah,
stab at that?
Saving your authentication codes. It's super important, and you should always save them. Even if you depend on your phone or whatever, you should back them up somewhere that's
Right.
secure. There are a lot of companies, even for GitHub, my company requires that you have 2FA enabled on your account, and I'm not a big fan of it because I'm never near my phone for some reason, even though I'm always on Discord. But yeah, at some point you do need security with a different method to access it from. But that said, that isn't an excuse for just having SMS access or something.
Right.
It's more so that hey, you're this user, but also I need something that only this user usually has on them or knows about themselves, and that's sort of where MFA stems from.
Right.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is where hardware keys are really going to. Then this is where I think hardware keys can really come into their own. Right, things like YubiKey,
You're right.
things like that. Right, you plug them into your PC and you prove that you're you. Right. As it stands, going back to the SMS thing you mentioned earlier, that was the worst thing to ever be introduced for multi-factor authentication, given that you got all these problems with number spoofing and things like that.
Right.
But as it stands, I know, Shan, you mentioned there that it's a pain because you're not always near your phone and things like that. And I do have similar things for GitHub because most orgs require 2FA, I think.
Right.
But it's so important. I know it's a pain, and I know that there's this conflict between usability and security and things like that. But it is so important to make sure you've got it set up. And the easiest way to do it at the moment with the current infrastructure that everyone has set up with the web and their phones and things like that is via multi-factor authentication apps like Microsoft Authenticator or Google Authenticator or whatever it is, right? That is simply the easiest way to do it as it stands.
Right.
If things like YubiKeys were more common and more accessible, then for sure we could do that. That would possibly be even better. But as it stands, the only way to really get people to secure their accounts is by getting them to trying to get them anyway to download these sorts of apps like Microsoft Authenticator and Google Authenticator and things like that.
I've been a fan of this increasingly popular concept of having a password manager, like Warden or 1Password, and then you can hook it up with a service to have a TOTP, time-based one-time password, and that way, whenever you're signing in, the application will send your password manager that some verification key, and you type that in, And your password manager takes care of it for you. So you could have a password manager on your phone, your laptop, whatever. And you're no longer tied down to having a single hardware, but more like having access to your password manager, which is a centralized place for all your passwords. And that's
Yeah,
a big fan.
yeah. Password managers are great. I mean, I use one password for everything personally, but one thing I often think about is whether it's just moving the problem backwards, because you've still got access to, I mean, one password in particular has a really good implementation for this, because
Right,
in order
yeah.
to log into one password, you need your master password. You also need your secret key, right?
Right.
It has a really, really good implementation for this. Arguably, it could be even better with a hardware key for actually logging into your password manager. And that ideally would mean we wouldn't need a change to the majority of web infrastructure as well, right? Because the problem with, I know it's been mentioned before, it's mentioned in a lot of places, replacing passwords with things like hardware keys, right? The problem with that is that it's just not going to happen. That's the problem with it. Sure, it may be great, but I can tell you now, for the vast majority of the web, it's just not going to happen. There's too much change. And so if we can move the problem back a bit, maybe require hardware keys for one thing, which is your password manager, and let your password manager deal with the rest, I think that would actually go a long way to helping to, if not solve this problem, then at least make it a little bit easier to work with.
Yeah, but the common argument against having your password manager be like hardware tied is what if you need to log in on a public computer or something?
Yeah,
And then the
yeah.
best thing you could do is like pull up your phone and then click that view password and then type that long string in manually, which isn't
Yeah,
always work.
it's not easy. It's yet another thing that isn't yet a solved problem. Password
Right.
managers are an improvement, especially once you have one master password and maybe a secret key to log in, something like that. Because then you can't add your password manager to another device without your secret key, which is itself inside your password manager. Of course, you're completely screwed if you lose access to your password manager. But there we go.
Yeah.
One of the interesting things that was mentioned was single page apps and OpenID Connect. It was Vexen said the worst part is implementing this bleep into a single page application. There's all these stuff about implicit flows and things like that for OpenID Connect, which people are trying to phase out and things like that. There's fairly new, not particularly new, but fairly new standards coming out for this sort of thing that most places are using now with PKCE for the authentication flows for single page applications, whereby it actually means you're essentially using in the browser the authentication code flow, which then uses dynamic secrets generated by the browser instead. So it's worth looking into that. Unfortunately, it is painful to implement. That's why I would hope that soon the library situation for that will improve.
Mm-hmm.
Often on a lot of apps, I've heard developers say that it's all copy paste for authentication. You don't have to worry about it. I like that idea of everything just copy and paste, just move everything away because it's supposed to be a solved problem. And it's very similar throughout your applications.
Yeah, but it's just not. It never will be because these things are constantly evolving.
We talk about SMS-based authentication. I just don't even know why that was considered. I guess convenience, but it's just such a bad idea. You just think about it and just horrors in general.
I was going to say I'm seeing some things on the chat. Studio points out that it sounds counterintuitive. Password manager is used for both the password and the OTP. That becomes one factor, and yeah, you're absolutely right. It does, but you've got to. The problem with users is that they're fickle, and that you need to try and drive good practice when they're really, really resistant to that, right? And so what this allows is that it means users are far more likely to use strong passwords that are unique across services rather than weak passwords with SMS based things, right? So it's a compromise with regards to how far you think users are actually going to be willing to go.
So earlier, I was going to say that when SMS authentication came out, it was more or less a new concept, and it wasn't something that was very easily spoofable. Like, it wasn't like an idea that SMS is weak. The idea was that it's a pretty good concept here. Users only have access to their phones. They only have access to their SMS. No one can spoof them usually. Um, and then like people came around and started breaking that concept, and now it's a bad idea. But at the time, it wasn't so bad.
Mm, yeah, yeah. There's an interesting chat going on about the QR code stuff in the podcast about the scan a QR code to log in. That is certainly an interesting topic, and it's got very, very, very polarized views across the industry. That it's a topic that companies like Discord are keen to implement because it simplifies the login process, right? At the same time, as you mentioned there, people do fall for the scan this QR code to log in and or to get Nitro and things like that. It's fraught. It's absolutely fraught. And the more easy you make these things, even if they're secure technically, the user is still the weak link, right? The user is always the weak link in these things. And so anything that makes things easier for attackers to implement social engineering techniques is arguably not a great way to go.
Yeah, regarding biometric auth, I just saw something. When you say biometric, generally, do people mean fingerprints, or does it also include things such as your eye, retina, and things like that? Because a fingerprint auth, I guess, is kind of common at this point. Like most phones come with fingerprint sensors now, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's certainly widely. I mean, certainly widely used within password managers and things like that as well. And you can implement it on your multi-factor apps, right? So
Right.
I know that Microsoft Authenticator does this because I use it, right? In order to use the code that from Microsoft Authenticator, or in order to do the notification thingamabob that it offers, I have to authenticate with Face ID. So it is possible to add biometric authentication into the mix. I don't think it's a replacement because, again, like most of these things that are supposed replacements, it require so much of a change to the infrastructure that is already in place for the majority of the web that it's just not going to happen.
Right.
And so we should be focusing on improving what we have and making that as safe as possible.
For sure.
Yeah, I may have mentioned this, but I come from a very medical-centric family. I'm the only one in not a medical field or education. So I don't know if you guys know this, but the MCAT uses palm vein scans at the moment for biometrics, and I find that to be a very secure way of verifying one's identity, because unlike fingerprints, you don't leave your veins out in the open somewhere, right? It's not like somebody could just get you to drink a coffee and then scan your veins. And veins are pretty unique to people, and so like that's I see that as a pretty up and rising way of biometrics. And of course, you can't implement that with like a lot of technologies, but it is a way to identify a user and not have that identification method compromised.
Yeah, it's certainly there, but again, it's one of those things where, much like this and the WebAuthn that's just been mentioned in the podcast channel, it's not going to be possible to change the world, right? There's too much there. There's too much on the internet to change, to just switch everything out like that, right? It works well as a way to access the password manager is a good example, right? All these sorts of things like WebAuthn and things like that, they are brilliantly designed and work well for things like accessing your password manager. But there are so many sites and so many different things that are all based on this password method that trying to change them all instead of trying to make our password management more secure seems like a futile attempt, in my opinion anyway. Ooh, JWTs. Should we talk about JWTs?
I do wanted to talk about JWTs actually.
I just mentioned it because there's a load of stuff in there. I mean, this doesn't have to be part of the podcast anymore. We can finish that and just have a general chat.
If you guys gonna go talk about JWTs, go ahead. We still have like 11 minutes before we kind of done this thing over.
Yeah. Well, just because I've seen it mentioned there, and I know that there's often I see it so much in TPH.
Right.
So much about stuff conflating JWTs and session management and things like that, and it drives me mad. So yeah, it's I'd like to take the opportunity to just say it. Please do not use JWTs for session management. It will not end well. It is terrifying, right? JWTs are by nature supposed to be stateless. Okay, that is literally the whole point of them coming into being. Signed tokens, the whole point is that they can be stateless authentication for your REST APIs, things like that, right? A session is fundamentally a stateful thing, right? Using a stateless object for managing something stateful is a logical inconsistency. It don't work.
We should also talk about like why it's stateful. And the clear reason is just being able to revoke access, like logging out users, banning them, changing their permissions, changing their passwords. All of that is stateful, and it's not something that you could do with JWTs because they are they don't require any lookup, and they're like just a single source of truth, really.
I mean, you can do this sort of thing with JWTs, right? You could do session management with JWTs, right? It is possible to do, but in order to do proper session management with your JWT, you need to make it stateful. So what's the point, right? So the problem is, so if we look back, if we look over what a session is, right? A session is a one process of saying that a user is logged in and they remain logged in, they remain authenticated until either the session is deleted or the session times out or whatever it is, right? And the problem that you have with trying to manage that with JWTs, trying to manage that with any sort of signed stateless object, is that when they need to log out, how do you cancel it, right? A JWT has, well, an access token would hopefully have a very short lifetime, but in order to log them out, you need to immediately blacklist that token. And when you blacklist that token, that means that on each request, you have to check whether the token is in the blacklist, at which point you may as well pull out a session from the database. Right.
You can also relate Cros into this conversation by talking about the crypto aspect of JWTs. It uses hashing, which is SHA-256, I believe.
SHA-256.
Yeah, I believe that JWTs use SHA-256. But once that's deprecated, as computers keep on advancing, JWTs are entirely going to be useless at that point. And you're going to want to switch to new algorithms, right? Isn't that how things work? You never want to have stuff rely on hashes for authentication.
So with SHA-2 at least, I don't think we're gonna see them go down anytime soon. Like when I say anytime soon, I mean it in a long time. Obviously, I could be wrong since there has been cases where we have found pre-image attacks against hashes that we thought are totally secure, right? However, thankfully, the crypto community, so SHA is, for those of you guys who don't know, is a standardized hash. So what happens is NIST is this organization in United States, has this competition where they standardize a particular hash and they just make it the king, called the SHA, or the standardized hashing algorithm. So SHA-2 is one of those, right? And thankfully, we do know sometimes our presumptions about things that never getting broken do get broken. So SHA-3, which is a new hash, uses an entirely different mechanism for hashing things instead of doing what SHA-2 does, which is a lot like MD5. SHA-3 uses sponge construction, which you can actually read about, and it's really interesting. and it's also very, very fast on hardware, which is why they actually chose that. And very different from SHA-2, which again makes it a big advantage that, in case SHA-2 gets broken, at least SHA-3 would be still around and secure. But honestly, I do not really see the SHA-2 being the weak point with JWTs, because it has been studied a lot, and we have yet to find anything wrong with it.
No, I mean, the JWT itself is not something that the problem isn't with the token itself. And the problem isn't really with the signing of the token either, right? Because tokens are short-lived. So if you need to change the way you sign the token, you just switch it around next time you sign the next token, right? It's not a huge deal. But at the same time, the real problem is the fact that you're throwing these around all over the place, right? You're spraying JWTs everywhere. Access tokens, you're spraying them everywhere. All this sort of thing, right? That's what the weak point for this is, right? I'm a huge fan of gateways for this, right? Because the traditional session with a session cookie that is HTTP only, marked as secure, has same site strict on it or whatever, is still battle tested, right? It is used a lot. It has been used a lot, and it's battle tested. So I'm a huge fan of implementing gateways for this sort of thing. It works incredibly well for browser-based applications where you have a gateway that is in charge of your redirects for your OpenID Connect authentication, all that sort of thing, and it never throws the access token back to the browser. Instead, it does its own thing for keeping, generating, and refreshing access tokens, and there is just a plain old session for communicating with that gateway. Then when the front end sends an API request or whatever, that request actually goes to the gateway. The gateway does whatever it needs to do with the session, transform and grab a relevant JWT for that, and forwards the call onto the service. At which point we never have this problem of JWTs being exposed to the browser, right? Because it's purely done within the gateway. And it minimizes all these problems that we've got with JWTs in the browser and people arguing about whether they should be in local storage or session storage or cookies or all these sorts of things, right? If you were to take the code for Mozilla Firefox, right, and write it out on slates, on slabs of slate, and then bind them all together with string, the distance that you could throw that bundle of slates is about as far as you should trust the browser, right? It's ridiculous. It's one of those things that, you see people arguing about session storage or local storage or cookies or whatever. Don't put them in the browser, and your problems with that are solved, right? Stick a gateway in front of your services that can transform a plain old secure session token into a JWT and forward the request on. It is so much simpler and it just works, right? Sorry to rant, but yes, it's that is essentially my opinion on the matter. Granted, it is just an opinion, but yeah, the fewer stuff you throw into the browser, the better.
Right.
I've heard of this new approach where you use two tokens with a short-lived JWT and a long-lived opaque token.
Yeah, that's the refresh token.
Oh yeah. Is that the gateway idea or is it different?
No, so the gateway idea is slightly different, right? The gateway would have a plain old session for the user that lives in their browser, right? It would have a plain old session token where the session is a server-side session, right? Mm-hmm. Now, the gateway would store securely in memory, most likely, an access token for that user that it gained through an OpenID Connect flow, right? And the gateway would also have a refresh token because the access token is relatively short-lived, right? Your access token should not be longer than 5-10 minutes sort of thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so what your gateway can do is when it receives a request, it pulls out the access token that's attached to that session and it checks whether it's expired, right? If the access token is expired, it can then use a refresh token to, refresh it and then forward the request on to the underlying services with the access token attached.
Well,
So yes,
actually,
there are.
you're supposed to also refresh the refresh token as you're shooting.
Yeah. You can use it's a concept called rotating refresh tokens. You can add that to the mix as well. But the whole point is to have a gateway in front of your services that ensures you never need to send these tokens back and forth, and your front end doesn't have to deal with managing them. And you essentially simplify the process for your front end applications by a fair amount. They don't even need to know the session token exists, because as far as they're concerned, they're just sending all API requests to this gateway, and that deals with the authentication because it's done using the plain old session cookie, which is sent back and forth on every request.
I think we're past the time, and there's a lot of furious discussion going on in the podcast voice text. Unfortunately, we do not have the time to really talk about all the points that has been raised. But yeah, if you guys are interested in keep talking more, we have the general voice chat and voice script that you guys can actually just join and talk on, or just use the text channel. But for now, we will be ending the podcast since it's more than an hour now, which is what we wanted to cap our podcast at. But yeah, thank you very much for coming, and it was great to actually do this first podcast, and hope we have more podcasts in the future, and this doesn't end up being the only podcast. But yeah, thank you very much, guys, for coming.